So without further ado, let me introduce Chairman Bill Shuster.
Well, thank you very much. As always, it's great to be in front of the folks that run the transportation departments across the country. I think this is my third speech to this group, or some configuration of this group, in the last 4 or 5 months. So I'm always happy to do it, and always happy to get feedback, because like I said, you're the folks that deal with what we do here in Washington, or what we don't do here in Washington on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis. Let me first start off by, I know Senator Boxer's going to follow me today, and she's been a very good partner when we passed MAP 21. She was really one of the driving forces behind getting that passed, and I think there were a lot of good reforms in there that are going to be implemented here over the next couple of years, and help you folks be able to build roads faster and better. And I think we all acknowledge that time is money. So I appreciate her efforts, and she and I have already started talking about the WRDA bill, Water Resources Development Act, that's first up on both our plates. She and I don't agree on everything, but we both agree that a WRDA bill is very important to America, to the economy. And in fact, as I talk to my colleagues and we talk about jobs, economic development, and trade, the fourth thing that should roll off our tongues is transportation, the transportation system, because it's so vital to us. And I appreciate all the work that you folks at AASHTO and across the country have done to make sure that your systems are as in good a shape as they can be. And I know that's a challenge. We all know transportation it's fundamental. It's fundamental to families, whether they're getting to school, work, go visiting family members, but as I mentioned, to business, to creating jobs, economic development, opportunities for the citizens of this nation. And we're at a point that there's big challenges, and we need to, as a Congress, need to address those and work with our partners across the nation. I believe we are at a tipping point. We need to figure out how we move forward to be able to fund it at necessary levels, but also continue to build on those reforms in MAP 21 so that you can do more with less if necessary. And I think that's what MAP 21 put out there, that you can get those roads faster, and we need to do that again when it's in any mode. We need to have those kind of reforms in place. I usually, when I'm giving this speech, I always talk about what the road conditions are and the bridges. I was encouraged to do that again today because you guys like to hear that. But you know that story, so I'm gonna skip over that part because, like I said, you know firsthand, you know better than I know what the situation of the roads and the systems, whether it's the transit system in your states and cities, whether it's the harbors and ports that need attention, the inland waterway system. That's one thing that I like to harp on, because I think that's the part of the system that most Americans understand or even know exists. Unless you come from a river city, Pittsburgh, or along the Mississippi, you don't understand the importance of the waterways. And when you look at the modes of transportation, it's the most efficient, most cost-effective way to move, especially those large commodities. And there's definitely a need to deal with that. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that at WRDA. Aviation, our airports, over half of our 20 most congested airports, our busiest airports, are going to face major congestion problems in the future. It's one of those modes too that when you look at the airline industry, it's tobacco, guns, alcohol, the sin taxes. They're taxed less than an airline ticket. So I've said to people, it must be a sin to fly if we're taxing at that rate. And so we've got to stop looking at our airlines as a piggy bank. I know the president's offered up another fee, a landing fee or a takeoff fee, I can't remember which. Once again, we're just hammering an industry that is so vital, over $1 trillion to our GDP. We've got to figure out a way to really look at it and say to deregulate it, because today it's the most deregulated, regulated industry we have in this country, and need to have a focus on that. Part of the challenge that we face, that I face in moving different transportation bills through the Congress is first and foremost is to educate, I think, or reinforce to my colleagues, especially on my side of the aisle, that there is a federal role in transportation. We shouldn't do it all. In fact, you folks do most of it, but there is a component, there is there is the federal role that we need to make sure we're living up to. And as I talk about it to my colleagues, especially those that are the most conservative, I take them back through the history of the founding of this country, and it literally was a transportation issue that caused the founding fathers, after the Articles of Confederation, to say the Articles of Confederation don't work. Virginia and Maryland trying to negotiate a treaty to navigate the waters of the Potomac and a canal system and portage roads through Virginia and Maryland up into western Pennsylvania to open up the Ohio Territory with the vast resources they had there available. And when they failed to do that, Virginia, led by Washington and the others, realized that the Articles of Confederation were not going to allow us as a nation to physically connect ourselves and produce the commerce and the economic development and the jobs and the trade that we needed to grow ourselves into a nation. And so with that, they sat down and they drew up the Constitution. And as I like to remind my colleagues, that really the number one, or one of the top three philosophers that the Founding Fathers read and adhered to was Adam Smith. And Adam Smith said, besides the market, the invisible hand of the market, but he said his government has three functions. One is to provide security, second, to preserve justice, and the third, to erect and maintain infrastructure to promote commerce. So when I speak to my friends at the Heritage Foundation, who, by the way, give away the Adam Smith Award, sometimes I ask them about that, and it kind of draws a blank stare at me, but I think it's important, especially in the times we live in, that we are reminded of those lessons of history, reminded how we got here, and the 230 years since the founding of the Constitution was written and ratified to where we are today. And it's been a federal role, whether it's the first earmark, a lighthouse in Massachusetts, which now Maine, to the canal system, to the Transcontinental Railroad, to the Panama Canal, to the Interstate Highway System. The federal government has always been and needs to be involved in creating and promoting and maintaining that national transportation system. On the committee, just a month ago, I guess it is now, we had our first organizational meeting. We're going to be dealing with a lot of those issues, and as I said, trying to reinforce to our members that there is a federal role. We need to do it responsibly, when we're doing these things, whether it's fiscally or the reforms. We've got to have responsible reforms and responsible pay for. But I'm reaching across the aisle to my Democratic colleagues to try to rebuild bipartisanship on the committee, because as most of you know in here, it's in your states as well as in Washington, it's been one of the great bipartisan issues in Congress has been transportation, has been the infrastructure. So we're making an attempt to move forward in that way. Communicating regularly with my Democratic counterpart, Nick Joe Rahal from West Virginia, and all the members on the committee. But broader than that, both sides of the aisle in the committee and in Congress, and even started to the effort to reach across the Capitol to make sure that whether it's meeting with Senator Boxer or Senator Thune or Senator Vitter, to make sure that the first time I sit down across the table for them to negotiate a complicated piece of legislation, that they know me, I know them, and we have some idea on the ground we're going to fight for. So we've gone forward to try to establish those relationships. As I said, the committee is going to be busy this Congress, starting with a WRDA bill. And when I say WRDA, I always have to say Water Resources Development Act, not because I don't know it, but because half the members of the House today weren't around in 2007. And so again, that's the educational challenge that we have to make sure they understand what the WRDA bill does, and if they're coming from a port or a river city, they have some understanding of it. So. But the WRDA bill's up first, and we're working diligently, meeting with the stakeholders, getting their input, talking to them, trying to figure out what's positive, what's negative, what kind of reforms they'd like to see, so we can craft a piece of legislation. And then we roll it out broader to the members of our conference, to talk to them on both sides of the aisle, to try to come to some sort of consensus, at least somewhere where we can all agree on. And I'm sure, though, there's going to be fights on issues here and there, but I think trying to come to that bill that has strong bipartisan support is going to be something that we need to pass it. The passenger rail, or the rail reauthorization, we'll be dealing with later this year. Something that, again, when it gets to the ports of this country, most of the time it gets on a rail to the inland ports, which then gets on the truck. So making sure that safety issues are dealt with rail, and also passenger rail. I watched the last 40 years the debate in Congress, and Republicans usually stand up and say, Amtrak's failed, we ought to sell it off, do away with it all. Well, I don't agree with that, because I think there's a need for passenger rail in this country. My counterparts on the other side of the aisle talk about that there's no passenger rail system that's not subsidized in the world, and we have to do it, and they're right, but I think they're wrong in that we can't get Amtrak to a place that they're not taking as big subsidies from the federal government. They can get to a place, I think, where they may be able to get close to break even. Because when you look at the numbers of the population in the United States, it took us 65 years to go from 200 million people to 300 million people, and we crossed that threshold in 2005. And they projected in 2005 it will go from 400 million people in just 32 years. Well, we're 7 years into it. So 25 years from now, we're going to have another 100 million people in this country, and not everybody's moving to Florida and Arizona. When you look at the population growth, the North, I know Arizona and Florida would like to see that, but then they're going to have those problems. But when you look at the corridors of this country, they just continue to grow out. The density's there and becomes more dense in places. So I think passenger rail, Amtrak, there's a place for it. I think there needs to be reforms when you're dealing with Amtrak. And when you're talking about high-speed rail, I think the place we ought to focus on high-speed rail is the one place we own the tracks, the one place we have the most condensed population in the nation. 19% of our population live in 3% of our land mass in the Northeast Corridor. That's where we should focus. Focus there so we're able to achieve it, learn from it, and then roll it out to other parts of the country. And just to make people sure that I'm from Pennsylvania, but I'm from Western Pennsylvania. That's not the Northeast Corridor. Philadelphia's in the Northeast Corridor. And I have my challenges with Philadelphia, so this is not a parochial issue for me. It is an issue that I think is important to the nation. Even when you look at passenger rail in that corridor, that congested corridor, when you look at the air space above the Northeast Corridor, the most congested in the country, most congested probably in the world, 70% of the canceled or delayed flights either start or are supposed to end up in the Northeast Corridor, and so there's a huge problem with that congestion in the airspace there, and this is another, I think, solution to that corridor and improving it. And then finally, we're going to be dealing with the next surface transportation bill. And we'll be starting in earnest on that very shortly. Again, meeting with stakeholders, trying to figure out the reforms that we need to build upon. But of course, the big question, the $400, $500, $600 billion question is how do you pay for it? And I believe that we have to look at every option out there. I don't rule anything out. I don't rule anything in. I think we've got to have this dialogue to understand, what's the best way to continue this. And going away from the user pay, the pay-as-you-go system, I think is the wrong way to do it. I think it's worked well for us, but of course we've got our challenges with the trust fund today because of 50-mile-an-hour cars and electric cars, and we've got to figure out a way to be able to have a trust fund that's sustainable at least for the next decade. I'm not so sure that we have the technology in place or the will to do a vehicle miles traveled, but again, that's something that we need to look closely at. Some other ideas, thinking outside the box, public-private partnerships, I think are important. We did expanded TIFIA, which I know has been a success, but one of the ideas we had in the last in Bill MAP 21 was to take the royalties and the leases from the offshore and federal lands, the oil and gas that comes up from them, and put it into the trust fund. The CBO killed us on that. It said it's about $1 billion. Talked to a number of experts that said it's much larger than that, and actually been talking to former Speaker Newt Gingrich about his folks, and they believe that it's bigger than that, and something that is a part of the solution, or could be part of the solution, not necessarily the answer. But as we move through that process and considering everything, talking about reforms, it is absolutely critical that the folks in this room and across the country are part of the messaging, part of the education process that goes on, not only to the American people, but also to members of Congress to make them understand. I like to use the Port of Charleston as an example. There's folks from that delegation that weren't real interested in infrastructure until just a couple years ago. They realized that if you don't dredge the Port of Charleston 5 feet, you're not going to get this these new cargo ships coming in from the Panama Canal. So that's a big issue for South Carolina. It's an issue to the magnitude of $45 billion to their economy, and it will grow from there. I met with the port director yesterday and asked him, who's your biggest customer in South Carolina, or who's your biggest customer at the port? And it was not anybody from South Carolina, it was a chemical company in eastern Tennessee that's their biggest. So not only does it affect South Carolina, it's going to affect that whole southern region down there to make sure that those products get in and out efficiently and that they can compete in the world market. But that education process, I know there are some folks in town, a couple different folks that have talked about setting up advocacy groups. I know I see Graham Hill here today. He's one of those folks who've been talking about doing those things. Former Secretary Mary Peters and a number of other folks that I know well, former Congressman Bob Dole, former Congressman John Sullivan, have set up America's Infrastructure Alliance. I understand that the airlines, rail, truckers, waterways, and the AGC has provided seed money for them to be able to develop a educational plan to go across this country to raise the money, and it's going to take a significant amount of money to put a campaign ad on TV that educates the American people to make sure they understand that that carton of milk that's in the refrigerator, or it's on the shelf in the refrigerator in the grocery store, didn't get there magically. It was probably 7 or 8 transportation moves from the time the fertilizer is delivered at the farm till it finally gets to that grocery store and gets to the refrigerator that was in the system. And again, I think it's lost on a lot of American people that it's that national system, it's that integrated system, coordinated system that gets it there, and so it's 10 cents or 20 cents or 30 cents cheaper than it otherwise been if we didn't have the system that we have in place. So educating the American people is going to be imperative to moving a surface transportation bill. And then when we get down to bringing legislation to the floor, again, going to members of Congress and making sure they understand in their state, in their district, in their hometown community, what it means to that location if we don't have a transportation system that's coordinated, that's funded, that's well-maintained, that can, again, get our products to and from market. So I look to you as we move forward for your advice, but also to help me in the effort to educate the American people and members of Congress so that we can have a robust transportation bill next year in the next Congress. So again, thank you all very, very much for having me here. I appreciate all the work that you do in your states, and again, AASHTO and your leadership here in Washington is very much engaged with us on the committee, but it really is much more powerful when people from the real world show up in Washington. I sat with a bunch of my farmers this morning, most of them I know, and I tell them, you know, when you come to town, it's not the Farm Bureau, it's Lauren Roy from Bedford County, Pennsylvania, telling me if you don't pass this or if you do pass that, it's going to hurt me or help me. So your voice coming from the states, coming from the real world is very powerful, and I'd encourage you to continue to come to Washington and make sure you bring the message to Congress. So thank you very much.